how did David avenge the Gibeonites for what King Saul had done? This is the question we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of 2 Samuel on walking through the Bible. Today we're going to be discussing 2 Samuel chapter 21, verses 1 to 14. But before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, turn to 2 Samuel chapter 21, verse 1. But if you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So 2 Samuel chapter 21, beginning of verse 1. Now there was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year, and David inquired of the Lord. And the Lord answered, It is because of Saul and his bloodthirsty house, because he killed the Gibeonites. So the king called the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not of the children of Israel, but of the remnant of the Amorites. The children of Israel had sworn protection to them, but Saul had sought to kill them in his zeal for the children of Israel and Judah. Therefore David said to the Gibeonites, What shall I do for you? And with what shall I make atonement, that you may bless the inheritance of the Lord? And the Gibeonites said to him, We will have no silver or gold from Saul or from his house, nor shall you kill any man in Israel for us. So he said, Whatever you say I will do for you. Then they answered the king, As for the man who consumed us and plotted against us, that we should be destroyed from remaining in any of the territories of Israel, let 7 men of his descendants be delivered to us, and we will hang them before the Lord in Gibeah of Saul, whom the Lord chose. And the king said, I will give them. But the king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, because of the Lord's oath that was between them, between David and Jonathan, the son of Saul. So the king took Armoni and Mephibosheth, the 2 sons of Rizpah, the daughter of Ai, whom she bore to Saul, and the 5 sons of Michal, the daughter of Saul, whom she brought up for Adriel, the son of Barzillai, the Maalathite. And he delivered them into the hand of the Gibeonites, and they hanged them on a hill before the Lord. So they fell, all 7 together, and were put to death in the days of the harvest, in the first days, in the beginning of the barley harvest. Now Rizpah, the daughter of Ai, took sackcloth and spread it for herself on the rock, from the beginning of the harvest until the late rains poured on them from heaven. And she did not allow the birds of the air to rest on them by day, nor the beasts of the field by night. And David was told what Rizpah, the daughter of Ai had, the concubine of Saul, had done. Then David went and took the bones of Saul and the bones of Jonathan his son from the men of Jabesh Gilead, who had stolen them from the street of Bethshan, where the Philistines had hung them up, after the Philistines had struck down Saul in Gilboa. So he brought up the bones of Saul and the bones of Jonathan his son from there, and they gathered the bones of those who had been hanged. They buried the bones of Saul and Jonathan his son in the country of Benjamin in Zelah, in the tomb of Kish his father. So they performed all the king commanded, and after that God heeded the prayer for the land. At the end of the last chapter, we marked the complete end of the rebellion that occurred during the latter portion of David's reign, the first being Absalom's and the second being Sheba's. It would thus be natural, if we were writing the narrative, to continue to the latter portions of David's reign, but the author of 2 Samuel doesn't appear to do that. Rather, he goes and relays to us a story that happened earlier in David's reign. Now, why would he do this? Because in many ways, the stories of chapters 8 through 20, with perhaps the exception of chapter 9, are all interconnected. David's wars led him into battle with the Ammonites. It was during that battle, which he should have been participating in, that he committed adultery with Bathsheba, and everything that followed was really punishment for that sin. So, the author of 2 Samuel, having finished that overarching narrative, returns to now an event that must have occurred earlier in David's reign, though we don't know exactly when. By the mention of David saving Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, that would seem to place this story after that, which we said likely occurred when David was around 45 years old. That means that this story could perhaps have occurred in one of the 5 intervening years, perhaps between the events of David's adultery with Bathsheba and Amnon raping his sister Tamar. If it occurred here, this would make even more sense as to why this story is placed here in 2 Samuel, as that would actually be following the events of chapters 9 through 11, with the aftermath of David and Bathsheba narrative being completed before returning to the events of this chapter. Regardless of when it took place, though, what we have is a 3-year famine in the land of Israel. Now, a 1-year famine might not be out of the ordinary, and maybe even 2 years. But after 2 years, and when it got into the 3rd year, David determined that this must be from the Lord, and so he inquired of the Lord, only to find that God was punishing Israel for what Saul had done to the Gibeonites in killing many of them. Recall back to Joshua 9 that Israel had made a treaty with the Gibeonites soon after entering the Promised Land, which said that Israel wouldn't kill the Gibeonites, but would protect them. Saul had evidently broken that treaty, at which time we don't know, and it seems that the actions had been continuing past his death, hence the Lord's actions here about 15 to 20 years into David's reign, and about 8 to 12 years into David's reign from Jerusalem. Now, even though this was an ill-advised treaty, one that the Lord did not command, God was going to hold Israel to their oaths. And so David went to the Gibeonites and asked how he could atone for the sins of Saul. The Gibeonites said that they didn't want money, for that would have been known to be forbidden under the law of Moses in Numbers 35:31. No, they wanted blood for blood. So they requested 7 men of the descendants of Saul to be delivered to them to be put to death. Now, at first glance, it might seem that these 7 sons, which were actually grandsons, were completely innocent. Why should they have to be put to death for the sins of their father, something else the law of Moses forbade in Deuteronomy 24, verse 16? But sometimes, when we examine something for the first time, we may miss an important detail. How did the Lord describe Saul and his household? As a bloodthirsty house. God didn't just describe Saul as bloodthirsty. No, he described his entire household as bloodthirsty, meaning that Saul's descendants had walked in Saul's footsteps, and perhaps even had continued killing Gibeonites, whose city fell within the tribal land of Benjamin. So after looking closer, we find out that Saul's sons deserved the punishment they received, for they were not innocent. And so David selected the 2 sons of Rizpah, Saul's concubine, who Abner was accused by Ishbosheth back in chapter 3 of sleeping with, and 5 sons of Merab, the daughter of Saul, who had been married to Adriel, the son of Barzillai the Meolathite. David spared Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, because of his oath made to Jonathan. Let's note a couple things before moving on. 1, there obviously is a scribal error in verse 8, for we know from 1 Samuel 18 that Merab married Adriel, and Michal married David, and later Paltiel. This does not discredit the accuracy of the Bible, for transcription errors can happen. The second thing to note is that this Barzillai is a different Barzillai than helped David while on the run from Absalom, for they are from 2 different places. When these sons were given to the Gibeonites, they were killed and their bodies were hung on a hill before the Lord as an example to those who might think of doing something similar. This was done at the barley harvest, which would be in early April around the Passover time. Now it was customary that bodies of the dead were removed at the sundown. But from what we find the actions of Rizpah were, who mourned from the beginning of the barley harvest until the late rains occurred, which would be in October, the bodies were hung there for 6 months. Why this was true we don't know, but suffice it to say the famine did not end until these bodies were buried. So perhaps the Lord withheld the end of the famine until the bodies, even the bodies of the guilty, were properly buried. Buried alongside these sons' bodies in the tomb of their ancestor Kish were the bodies of Saul and Jonathan, whom David fetched from their burial place in Jabesh Gilead, a burial we saw back in 1 Samuel 31. After all this was done, God ended the famine, as the sins of Saul were now atoned for. All in all, this story teaches us about the consequences of sin and the need to fulfill the promises that we made to others, even if we ourselves didn't make the promise. So that ends this section of chapter 21, with the rest giving us a completely separate event that happened during the reign of David. So we'll hope you return for that lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of 2 Samuel chapter 21, verses 15 to 22, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time.
Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.